Yo, what's going on YouTube? Good to Grant back here with another one, and in this video I'm going to be showcasing my Swarm Stinger Centipede Spiritborn build. This build is centered around the core skill Stinger. Using this core skill and other mechanisms, we are able to spawn swarms, which then enhance our overall poison damage based on the amount of swarms that we have active at any given moment. In a lot of ways, this build encapsulates the old school Season 1 and 2 Rogue. It's fast paced with high mobility and high defenses as long as you know how to cook it, and that poison damage is absolutely toxic to any enemy that it encounters. Couple this with AoE swarms that deal circular poison damage around you, you can absolutely go through dungeons and any form of content, wiping the entire screen with ease. With that introduction for the build out of the way, I'd like to take a short moment to go ahead and give an explanation as to how some of the Spiritborn's mechanics actually work. The Spiritborn has 4 types of spirit animals, each with their own respective skills. The Jaguar incorporates fire damage and fast-paced multi-attacks. The Eagle channels lightning damage and hones in on mobility and benefiting from its enhancements. The Gorilla comes swinging heavy physical damage with its high investments and damage reduction and other forms of mitigation. The Centipede harbors a deadly bite utilizing a toxic poison, which pairs perfectly with a myriad of debuffs. In addition to each spirit having its own respective skills, they also grant specific class bonuses, each applying a specific passive effect to aid you in your progression, similar to the Druid's spirit boons. The Spiritborn can select 2 of these bonuses at will, with no restrictions on mixing and matching outside of personal preference or potential build synergies. Your primary bonus is unlocked at level 15, and later on at level 30 your secondary slot is unlocked for you to socket your final spirit bonus. The Spiritborn's main resource is called Vigor. In addition to Vigor, the Spiritborn introduces 2 new proc effects, the first being Ferocity. Ferocity will increase your attack speed by 5% per stack up to 4 times each stack, lasting 4 seconds. And the second being Resolve, which increases your damage reduction by 20% while at least 1 stack is active. Taking direct damage will consume a stack of Resolve, and the base amount of stacks is set to 8, but as we'll see later, you can increase this amount as well as synergize off of it to create a pretty interesting build combination. I do want to note that within the skill tree there are some passives that have been added that do not reflect on max roll, so for that specific reason you won't see any of them in this specific guide. However, I will be updating future guides to reflect this change moving forward, especially when it comes to my mid to end game variants. Diving right into our skill tree, you can see that for our basic we are going to opt for Rock Splitter once again. We're speccing into Rock Splitter for 2 very specific reasons, the first of which is Enhanced Rock Splitter, which allows us to gain 15% additive increased block chance, and whenever we block we gain 11 vigor. If you watched my previous video, then you might know through a pairing of aspect synergies, we are able to multiplicatively scale our crit strike damage based on the amount of block chance that we have. The second bonus is obtained by speccing into Sharp Rock Splitter. Sharp Rock Splitter will allow our third attacks to knock back enemies and grant resolve per enemy hit. Seeing as we don't have any other way to actually generate resolve and our build mainly scales off of resolve to gain increased critical strike damage to henceforth increase our direct poison damage as well as damage over time poison damage, this is why Rock Splitter is kind of the only basic skill that you can go if you're looking to synergize in the way that I do in this specific build variant. This build being Centipede centralized, it only makes sense for the core skill to be Stinger. Stinger is an AoE poison skill that just so happens to synergize with a various amount of aspects that allow you to create a numerous amount of swarms that then circle around you and essentially AoE any enemy that's on screen. Dropping down, we can see that Enhanced Stinger now allows us to take 50% of the base direct initial poison damage and convert it to poison damage over time. This grants us an extra damage proc and overall serves to further enhance the poison damage bucket that we are looking to focus. We are opting for Advantageous Stinger. This is going to allow us to heal whenever we strike a vulnerable enemy for 10% of our maximum life, and while we are healthy, it will make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. From what I've personally seen, sources of healing and the vulnerable proc itself are few and far between, so getting 2 for 1 here is definitely a pretty big benefit. This is one in a list of many why Stinger is probably one of the best core skills you can potentially spec into throughout your journey as a Spiritborn. Now, wrapping up our core skill section here, we are going to be picking up the Vigorous passive, as this will grant us 15% multiplicative increase Vigor generation whenever we cast a core skill. From what I gather, Vigor really won't be a problem, especially during the late game. However, early on, I don't want there to be any sort of issues with casting skills, so we're going to go ahead and pick this up just to make sure that there aren't any issues. Taking a look at our focus section here on our skill tree, you can obviously tell that we aren't really picking up any skills here. However, we are going to pick up a few passives, the first of which being Mirage. This is going to give us a 60% additive increase to dodge chance during our evade, and then whenever we dodge, we're going to gain 15% additive increase critical strike chance for 3 seconds. Early on, I feel like this is probably going to be pretty beneficial, especially considering we won't be able to get the exact gear that we're looking for with crit strike chance, etc., especially with better rolls. So this will fill that gap in the meantime until you can get late game gear. Jumping up, we're going to be picking up Unstrained Power. This grants us 12% multiplicative increased damage whenever we have Unhindrance or Unstoppable. There are multiple sources of both of these, some of which we will discuss later on. Advancing on to our defensive section of the skill tree, we're going to start off with our passives here, the first of which being Endurance. This allows us to gain 5 Vigor whenever we cast a defensive skill. We know that this is only a path to get to the other passives, so we won't pay too much focus to this. Jumping straight up to Perseverance, we're going to be getting 1.5 additional damage reduction per stack of Resolve, and due to a few synergies, we are able to stack a absurd amount of Resolve, well beyond that initial 8 stack limit. At the end of the day, this is just for extra defense, so if you don't feel like you're lacking in your defensive side of the build, then you by all means can drop this for a free 4 points to go ahead and spec your skill tree out a little bit differently. When it comes to our first and most important defensive skill, we have Armor Hide. This will passively allow us to generate Resolve every 5 seconds, but most importantly, while it's active, we encase ourselves becoming unstoppable and gaining 100% additive block chance for 5 seconds. As we've mentioned previously, due to a pairing of aspects and other variables, we are able to multiplicatively scale our crit damage based on our block chance. Early on, to aid us with our Resolve generation, we are going to pick up Enhanced Armor Hide, as this will grant us maximum Resolve stacks whenever Armor Hide is actually active. This isn't an entirely necessary spec, so you could save 2 points here. However, just because I didn't feel that there was any other options that were currently available to me, I decided to put my final 2 points into these 2 specific places. The second of which being Reinforced Armor Hide, which will grant us 5% additive increased block damage while Armor Hide is active per nearby enemy, stacking up to a total value of 20. Once again, simply an extra additive defensive layer, but if you don't need it, then you could peel it back and go ahead and find a way to potentially pick up some additive damage or utility. For a second defensive skill, we have Counterattack. This passively grants us 10% additive dodge chance and will automatically retaliate against close enemies for 80% of their damage dealt. Whilst active, it will dodge all direct attacks for 3 seconds per cast up to 6 seconds. However, you might notice when looking over at my skill bar that we actually don't have this slotted. Reason being, if we just go ahead and take a look here, moving just past Counterattack Enhancement, which is going to allow us to reduce counterattack's cooldown by 0.5 seconds per stack of Ferocity. 1, we don't have Ferocity stacks, and 2, we don't have this socketed, so we aren't going to be even activating that cooldown. We can see that Reinforced Counterattack actually passively allows us to multiplicatively increase our critical strike damage by 6% per close enemy, up to a total value of 30% multiplicatively. I would say for any crit-centered build, this is a pretty good passive benefit, even if you do have to spend 3 points to get to it. It's the equivalent of essentially another passive node without it being a passive node. There are a lot of passive benefits from these skills. If you pay attention to them, there are different synergies that you can cook without even having that skill slotted onto your skill bar, similar to some of the synergies that the Sort harbors. But I digress. Taking a look at the final passives here within the defensive skill tree section, we have Anti-Venom. This is going to give us 45% additive increased poison resistance and increase our maximum poison resistance by 9%. I am spending 3 points here. However, based on your resistances and where you're at in your progression levels, you can determine as to whether or not 1 or 3 points is appropriate. Dropping down though and taking a look at nourishment, this is going to increase our healing by 20% additively, and then whenever we heal, our poisoning damage is going to be increased by 9% multiplicatively. This is a good way to scale our poison damage over time by a little bit, and overall is a worthwhile investment if you are a Centipede centered spec. Diving straight into the potency skills here, we are going to start off with Rushing Claw. Now, Rushing Claw is essentially Spiritborn's form of a dash. We are utilizing it as our primary and sole source of quote-unquote mobility. That being said though, I do feel like it is the most useful and efficient mobility skill for our specific circumstances, specifically due to the fact that it starts off early with additional charges, which you can later on invest even more into to gain additional charges and make this skill even better. Taking a look at our first Jaguar passive here, we are going to be picking up Potent. This is going to allow us to multiplicatively scale our overall damage by up to 30%. Due to the fact that we are early on utilizing the Jaguar Spirit Hall bonus to give us all skills are now Jaguar skills, we are able to take advantage of this passive very early on. Hopping over to the left, we have Touch of Death. This allows us to infect an enemy, dealing a base amount of poison as well as damage over time. Once the infection expires or the host dies, we will hatch a Swarm. The core skill of this build is Stinger. However, one of the core synergies of this build is Swarms, as we do take into account multiple factors that allow us to actually multiplicatively scale our overall damage based on the amount of Swarms that we have active on the playing field. Taking a look at Enhanced Touch of Death, this allows us to heal for 2% of our maximum life per second for a total of 18% maximum life with Touch of Death's infection. And then whenever a Swarm actually hatches, we're going to go ahead and heal for any remaining percentage of our health. Dropping down here and taking a look at Invasive Touch of Death, we can see that this allows Touch of Death Swarm to burst every second, applying 30% of its base poisoning damage over 6 seconds to surrounding enemies. This is an AoE effect that will allow us to chain that poisoning damage to any surrounding nearby enemy. Couple this with a few other variables, and this pretty much allows us to consistently have swarms out that are always hatching, exploding, and bursting that 30% base poisoning damage to surrounding enemies. Rounding out our potency skill section here, we're going to end it off with a few Centipede skill passives, starting off with Ravenous. This grants us a 7.5 multiplicative increase to our Centipede skill damage, which is then doubled whenever we are damaging a healthy enemy. Finally, we have Oppressive. This grants our Centipede skills 12% multiplicative increased damage to crowd controlled enemies, as well as 30% additive increased crowd control duration. These passives are overall just going to serve to give our Centipede skills that extra oomph that we really don't even need due to the fact that that poisonous bite is already toxic enough. But nonetheless, I'm not going to complain about a good thing, especially when it comes in the form of a damage increase. Getting us started off here within the ultimate skill tree section, we are going to obviously be picking up the Devourer, as we are a Centipede centralized build. That being said, apart from the Devourer just being able to spread its toxins through various means of direct attacks, it also gives us 2 very specific bonuses. The first of which being an AoE poisoning effect achieved through Harmonious Devourer, the first enhanced spec of Devourer itself. The second of which, the ability to execute enemies if the poison that is applied to them overseeds their current life total. In addition to this, if we kill an enemy that way, we are going to release a Pestilent Swarm, which, like we talked about, the build does synergize off of having swarms on the playing field, so this is a pretty important additional bonus right here. Rounding out our ultimate skills section with our passives, we first have Resolution. This grants us that 15% X multiplicative increase to elites whenever we cast an ultimate skill, which is then doubled if we're only fighting one elite. Right after that, we have Spiritual Attunement, which we know is just a connector for the preceding passive, so we don't have to pay too much attention to this one right here. The more important of which being Supremacy. Whenever we kill an enemy while an ultimate skill is active, we are granted a stack of Supremacy. Each stack is going to increase our damage by a multiplicative value of 3% up to a total of 30%, and then whenever our ultimate skill ends, we are going to get 5 stacks, but over time those will slowly drop. Next up here, if we wrap around to the bottom, we're going to go ahead and pick up Sustenance. Once again, this is kind of just a connector node in order to get to the next passive, but this will allow us to heal for 2% of our maximum life whenever we hit enemies with an ultimate, so it is a little bit of additional healing that isn't necessarily something that I can complain about. Finally here though, we have Intricacy. Upon casting an ultimate skill, the last different potency, defensive, or focus skill you cast prior is reset and can be cast for free up to 3 times in the next 5 seconds. If you guys watched my prior video, this is what allowed us to essentially spam the Razor Wings and craft an entire build around that centralized skill. In this specific circumstance, we are using this to reset either our Armored Hide or our Touch of Death in order to gain extra defense or overall damage through either source. Now that we've got all that covered, we can talk a little bit about our key passive, that being Noxious Resonance. This reads, your critical strikes cause your poisoning on an enemy to burst, dealing 100% of the total poisoning instantly to them and 20% of it to surrounding enemies before removing the poisoning effect from the primary target. This is then scaled based on the total amount of critical strike damage that you have in your overall bucket. It's a little bit strange. It's definitely not something that we're used to seeing, especially when we reference the Poison Rogue. We usually don't pair crit and physical damage with a poison variant. However, due to this specific key passive, we are able to use critical strike damage as our main multiplicative factor. That is going to go ahead and conclude the skill section of this video. Let's go ahead and move on to the affix and aspect breakdown. Before we dive right into taking a look at our aspects and affixes, I want to mention that most of the core mechanics for this specific build are very similar to my Razor Wing spec due to the fact that they are using the same series of synergies in order to boost their overall critical strike damage. Henceforth, meaning if you wanted to transition between the two or potentially make a combination of both, you'd be able to do so with relative ease. With a few slight variable changes, you can transition this build into several different variants of the same sort of concept and ideal playstyle that I'm crafting. I have various different specs and overall variants that all play into this concept and synergy. With that being addressed, let's go ahead and dive right in and take a look at our two-hander quarterstaff. We're going to be running the aspect of Pestilence. This allows our Stinger to go ahead and spawn that Pestilent Swarm, which deals 150% of Stinger's base damage per hit. Each Pestilent Swarm will now last 100% longer and spiral outwards. Like I mentioned, this build revolves around spawning different forms of swarms and then buffing yourself based on the procs that those swarms then grant you. As we move on, things will slowly start to come together and we'll pick up various other factors that will enhance our overall poison damage based on the amount of swarms or types of swarms that we have spawned in on the playing field at any given moment. Taking a quick look at our affixes here, like we mentioned, we are going to be blasting that crit strike damage as it does multiplicatively increase our overall poison damage through the use of our key passive. In addition to this, the only one that's really worth noting is the chance for Stinger to extra hit. This is a multiplicative source of damage, so this is definitely something that we want to spec into and invest into, being as we are a Stinger centralized build. Jumping up and taking a look at our boots here, we have the aspect of haste. This is going to give us 30% additive bonus movement speed for 2 seconds, up to a total accumulative benefit of 90% additive, and this is every second while we're moving. Mainly we're going to go ahead and pick this up because later on, once we get our uniques and unlock that secondary Spirit Hall benefit, we'll be able to attribute the secondary Spirit Hall to Eagle and henceforth gain access to the Brilliance passive Eagle node, which will give us increased overall Eagle skill damage based on the amount of movement speed that we have. However, for example, let's say you find the Scorn of the Earth prior to finding the unique helms. I would recommend potentially considering swapping out the legendary boots that you might have for the Scorn of the Earth, and then allowing yourself to gain the ability to cast Soar whenever you evade. This is a pretty good movement ability, and if you couple this with Rushing Claw, I'd say it's pretty overpowered. It just depends upon what stage of progression you're at and whether or not you get the Harmony Helm or not. If you do get the Harmony Helm, then it's entirely likely that you'll want to spec into the Eagle variant, which will allow you to gain access to the Brilliant passive, which will then scale your overall damage per skill based on the amount of movement speed that you have. Taking a look at our affixes here really quick, the first ones that should jump out to you are Stinger size. Obviously, because we're centralized around the Stinger, we are going to go ahead and increase the size of that. In addition, we are gaining extra charges on our Rushing Claw. Like I mentioned previously, we are able to get additional charges to this, which does enhance that movement ability even more. We're going to go ahead and pick up movement speed, but like I mentioned, you're going to want to invest in that a little bit more if you go ahead and get that Harmony Helm, and henceforth are able to unlock that Brilliance passive that allows you to scale your overall damage based on the amount of movement speed that you have. Therefore, the more movement speed that you have, the better. Like I mentioned previously, we're going to be reusing a lot of the same synergies. So on the pants, we have the Aspect of Interdiction, which is going to give us 15% additive block chance per resolve stack, which is later going to couple with another aspect to give us increased critical strike chance based on the amount of block chance that we have. Taking a quick look at our affixes, we're once again going to pick up that Stinger size, and this is the first time that we're seeing the maximum resolve stacks, but this is a temper that we can use to increase the overall amount of block chance that we have, and henceforth multiplicatively scale our overall crit damage, and then once again, therefore, increasing our direct poison damage through the use of our key passive. The only other one that I want to touch on is the resistance to all elements. There aren't too many sources on this specific class, so you're going to want to at least attribute 1 or 2 of your affix slots to resistance to all elements to make sure that you cap out on your overall resistances, especially once you start to push into your higher torment tiers. When it comes to our gloves, we're going to be running Redirected Force, and this is that aspect that allows us to take our block chance and multiplicatively convert it into overall crit strike damage. In addition to the base value of the effect, we also have the ability to double this value whenever we block an enemy. In reference to affixes, since we are running a core Stinger build, we are going to be picking up ranks to Stinger, critical strike chance, as well as attack speed. We pick up that critical strike damage as we are going to be able to use that in tandem with our key passive in order to increase our overall poison damage. When it comes to our chest piece, you're going to be seeing a lot of the same stuff. We're going to get the Aspect of Disobedience as we are running Unyielding Hits, which allows us to convert armor into raw damage in order to multiplicatively increase our raw DPS amount. When taking a look at the affixes, the only thing that I really want to note here that's going to be anything different than what I've already discussed is going to be the Armor Hide ranks. We are going to go ahead and pick this up as it is going to increase the direct duration of Armor Hide itself, which will help us increase that overall uptime on the 100% block chance, which once again will compound with other factors in order to increase our direct and overall dot poison damage. Rounding out our armor here, we have our helm with the aspect of Juggernaut. This is going to give us increased armor, like I mentioned before, because we're running Unyielding Hits. We are going to be picking up a little bit of cooldown reduction here, as well as that Stinger size and maximum resolve stacks. But the most important part that I want to mention here is as soon as you get the Helm of Harmony, you're going to want to instantly swap that out, as it's going to give you that 30% multiplicative increase per spirit that is on your skill, in addition to allowing you to gain the benefit of that spirit on your skill based on the secondary spirit hall benefit that you select. Jumping over to round out our gear by taking a look at our jewelry, our amulet is going to have the aspect of unyielding hits. This is what allows us to convert armor into weapon damage, and this is going to be facilitated by proccing a gorilla skill. Since our basic is a gorilla skill, we should be able to upkeep this even though the duration is only 3 seconds. And the way that this works is essentially the equivalency of having an extra weapon, increased IP, or increased DPS. When it comes to our affixes, as is true for most other classes, we're going to be primarily prioritizing passives, in this case oppressive, ravenous, and potent, as they are our current strongest multipliers. However, once you get the Helm of Harmony and switch over into the Eagle branch of the build, you could potentially swap out, say, oppressive for brilliance. When it comes to our rings, we're going to be focusing on our synergies with our swarms. Specifically with the first one here, we're going to be running the aspect of infestation. This is going to allow our centipede skills to potentially spawn pestilent swarms based on a lucky hit proc, and then pestilent swarms will now also deal 100% of their base damage as poisoning damage over 6 seconds, giving us that additional poison damage that we discussed previously. When it comes to our affixes, these should be pretty self-explanatory. We're kind of doing a lot of the same stuff that we did previously. We are going to go ahead and pick up Devour cooldown reduction. That's our ultimate skill. The only real reason why we picked this up is because I didn't personally particularly find any other tempers that slotted into the utility slot that would actually benefit me, so I decided to go ahead and go for this one. In addition to that, we go for the double crit damage to increase that overall poison damage once again through the route of our key passive. We got to pick up that crit chance, as we got to be able to actually have the chance to critically strike, and then we're going to pick up that attack speed because we got to hit that attack speed cap of 100 somehow. For our second ring, we are going to be running the Insatiable aspect. Upon kill, this will extend the duration of our active Touch of Death swarms by 0.2 seconds. When a swarm is replaced early, it bursts for 300% of the damage it would have done, which obviously is another source of multiplicative increases on our overall poison damage. The affixes are exactly the same as our previous ring, so I'm not really going to talk about those. But moving on, I do want to go ahead and reference the Spirit Hall choices here a little bit, so let's go ahead and move on to that section of the video. Jumping right in and getting us started off here with our primary Spirit Hall benefit, we are going to be choosing Jaguar, simply because we do want to make all of our Centipede skills Jaguar skills, so that we can gain that overall multiplicative damage benefit from Potent. When it comes to our secondary Spirit Hall bonus choice, this isn't going to be as beneficial early on, but once we achieve the acquirement of the Harmony Helm, we will be able to take full advantage of this, making whatever spirit we choose in this secondary slot echo its abilities to all skills that we have assigned, therefore giving us the ability to tap into the multiplicative damage increase of that Brilliance passive node that we mentioned previously. That is going to conclude our affix aspects and Spirit Hall section of this video. Let's go ahead and move on and take a look at our Paragon. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and mention that this specific build rendition is the starter variant and is designed for leveling in mind. That's specifically why I didn't have the uniques in the build, nor all of the points attributed. As you can see within the Paragon board, we still have 106 available points, but this is more so meant to be a build guide for early leveling mid-game. So I don't expect everybody to have all these points, and I don't want to confuse people by having the entire board spec'd out. So I want to kind of prioritize what's more important first and go over that. And so let's go ahead and take a look at our starter board here. We're going to have the Fester Glyph socketed. This is going to allow us to deal additional centipede damage. On top of that, it will allow us to deal 15% multiplicative increased damage to crowd control enemies with our Centipede skills. This is overall a pretty good benefit to our damage output with not only Centipede skills themselves, but poison damage itself as well. Jumping up and taking a look at our second board here, we are going to be picking Drive. Drive's legendary node reads, after moving 10 meters, you deal 3% multiplicative increased damage for 10 seconds. This can stack up to 10 times, equating to a total value of 30% multiplicative. Our glyph for Drive is going to be Colossal. This is going to give us increased gorilla damage, which isn't too important due to the fact that we don't actually really utilize gorilla damage through the use of our skills. However, the most important benefit that we're paying attention to here with this specific glyph is the 2% multiplicative increased damage for each stack of resolve. As we know, this build absolutely blasts resolve stacks in order to gain increased critical strike damage through the use of a synergy pairing of aspects. Basically, we stack block chance that increases our critical strike damage, and to get more block chance we actually have to stack resolve stacks. So since we're already investing in resolve stacks anyways, this glyph is perfect for our use cases. Our third Paragon board is going to be Convergence. The legendary node reads, you deal bonus damage equal to 20% multiplicative of your two highest bonuses to damage types combined, up to 30% total. This means you take your two total highest additive damage type pools, add them together to give you a total accumulative benefit of 30% multiplicative damage. When it comes to our socketed glyph for Convergence, we're going to go ahead and pick up Spirit. Now this is going to give us an additional amount of critical strike damage to enhance our poison through the use of our key passive. However, primarily the secondary benefit is going to allow us to gain increased damage to enemies up to a value of 15% multiplicative, stacking by 3% multiplicative for each critical strike. Up next for our fourth board we have Sapping. Sapping's legendary node reads, when you cast 3 Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, or Centipede skills with the same spirit in a row, restore 15% of your vigor and deal 30% multiplicative increased damage for 5 seconds. This means when you cast basically any Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, or Centipede skill 3 times, or if you cast a myriad of the same type of skill, i.e. Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, 3 times, then you will gain this bonus for 5 seconds. For our glyph, we are going to be picking up Consumption. This gives us increased damage to our pestilent swarms, like we talked about before, but most importantly, here is where the entire synergy for our swarms comes together. Through this individual glyph, we will be able to deal 2% multiplicative increased damage each active pestilent swarm and touch of death swarm. Debatably, you might want to pick this glyph up a little bit early on, and you can rearrange any of these glyphs in any manner you feel fit. However, I pushed it back a little bit because I'm not totally sure how fast or how efficiently we'll be able to get our swarms online, and I don't want to rely on them as our sole source of damage, if that makes sense. Rounding out our Paragon board here with our fourth board total, we are going to be picking up Revealing. Revealing's legendary node reads Lucky Hit, up to a 30% chance to knock down vulnerable enemies, and outright we deal 30% multiplicatively increased damage to crowd control enemies. Hopping around and taking a look at our final glyph here, we do have Fitness. Fitness is going to give us an increased value on critical strike damage, which once again increases our overall poison damage due to the fact that we are running the key passive that allows us to scale our poison damage based on the overall amount of crit damage that we have. And in addition to this, we are going to be able to generate 3 vigor whenever we critically strike. This benefit isn't really that important. I don't really even see us struggling with vigor early on, especially not once we get Paragon boards, so I'm not going to put this one anywhere but on the very final slot. And potentially if you wanted to socket something else here, try to play some different synergies into the build or something like that, you could entirely swap out this glyph right here for any you see fit. with that all having been covered, that's going to wrap up the build guide. I want to thank you guys for watching and let you guys know that I am going to have a variety of varying build guides and content in general coming out surrounding Diablo 4 and Season 6 Vessel of Hatred. And if you're interested in keeping up to date with the current iteration of this specific spec or any other build that I might release in the future, including in-game specs of builds that I've already showcased, as well as variants that I've yet to disclose, and other D4 Season 6 Vessel of Hatred related content, be sure to subscribe and give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed. This has been Goated Grand. Thanks for watching, and peace out.